I'm the state climatologist, and that means I'm basically the keeper of all the climate data for the state of Arizona. So if you need climate data, you just contact me and I will get you whatever it is you need for whatever purpose you need it for. So that's one of the things I do. The other thing I do is I come around and I talk to different groups about weather things. Climate of Arizona, the monsoon, the drought, dust storms, severe weather, tornadoes. We don't have many in Arizona, but we do in Flagstaff area from time to time, that kind of stuff. And so that's basically what I'm here today to talk about. I'm also one of the state coordinators for the CoCoRaHS program, which is a citizen observer precipitation rain and snow network. It stands for Community Collaborative Rain, Hail, and Snow Network. So I'm going to start with a little talk about this. Arizona is a desert, okay? Most of the state of Arizona is a desert. It's either dry or semi-dry, so we call it arid or semi-arid. The deserts in the world are usually located around 30 degrees north or south latitude, because that's area where we have air that sinks. We have high pressure and we have sinking air. When air sinks, it gets warmer, and when it gets warmer, if there's any clouds, it evaporates the clouds and we have clear skies. So that's one of the reasons we have clear skies most of the time. If you have clear skies, not going to get much rain. So these are the places. This is the Sahara Desert, most of Australia in that area. And we also have cold deserts. So up in Asia, we have cold deserts, and they're cold and they're very far from the moisture source. So in this case, the source of moisture for those areas is over here out in the Atlantic Ocean, and it's a long ways before it gets there, and by the time it gets there, it's all rained out. All the rain's already fallen, there's not much left. And then we have some areas that are deserts, like in South America and in the western US, that are cold because we have cold current. So this is the map of the US, the 30-year average precipitation that we would get. And so the blue areas are areas that are wetter over in the East Coast and the southern tier states around the Gulf of Mexico. And then we have the brown and dark areas that are drier. So we have the coastal mountains that tend to be very wet along the coast of Oregon and Washington and Northern California. And then we have, and those are the Olympic Mountains up in Washington. Then we have the Cascades, which is the next group of mountains. And then we have the Sierra Nevada in California. And then we get over and we have a few more mountains over in Utah, the Wasatch and the Uintas. And then we have the Rocky Mountains over here in Colorado. And so you can see most of the water falls really close to where the water source is, which is the Pacific Ocean. So why is that? Why does it look like this? Well, largely because we have cold water off the coast of California. So that water is coming from the poles, from the Aleutian Islands, and it comes down and it's very cold. It used to be, a lot of it was ice. Now it's melted, so it's very cold water off the coast of California. Cold water doesn't readily evaporate. So we don't get a lot of moisture in the atmosphere because it evaporated from the ocean because the water's cold. So if any of you have ever been to San Diego and you've gone into the ocean and you go, ah, and your feet hit the water and it's really, really cold and you go back sometimes. Some people like the cold water. Off the coast of the eastern part of the US, we have a warm water current, and so it's a lot more comfortable. But the cold water here is maybe around 65, 64 degrees. It's pretty cold. So we don't get a lot of atmospheric moisture. Normally, the pattern of weather storms is, this is what we call the jet stream. So this little loop of air through here, it comes down along the coast and then it crosses into Arizona much of the time in the winter, and then it heads off toward the northeast and catches Colorado and then goes into the Great Plains. So cold fronts are weather systems in the winter. We call them low pressure systems. They just come right along the jet stream, and they'll come down the coast of California and they'll typically dump a bunch of rain and snow and things. Then they'll cross into Arizona and then they'll head out. So that's usually how we get our winter precipitation. But the last 21 years we've been in drought, and most of that time what's happened is the jet stream has not come all the way down into Arizona. It's kind of crossed through Utah, and so the storms don't come here, and so we've had much, much drier conditions than we would normally have year after year after year. So this is a map, this is a little graph of Arizona precipitation. This is annual precipitation for the whole year, back from 1895 all the way through 2015. And when we look at this, we see we had a dry period where 10 out of 10 of these years right here were drier than average. And that was a significant time. That was when the people in the Phoenix area built Roosevelt Dam to hold water so they would have water for irrigation of their crops. They were growing a lot of cotton down there. And then that was followed by a wet period, and this wet period was 37 years long, and 23 of those 37 years were wetter than average, and only 14 were drier than average. And then we had another 37-year period that 29 of the 37 years were drier than average, and only 8 were wetter than average. Then we went to a wet period, and this was a 16-year period where 13 of the 16 years were wetter than average. This was really, really a wet time. And then we have the current drought, which is 21 years, and 16 of those years were drier than average and only 5 were wetter. One of the things you should notice about this, look at how variable this is. I mean, these aren't all just going up and down past, this is our average. They're just wiggling back and forth. I mean, they're huge jumps wetter and then huge jumps drier through the whole thing. That's normal for a desert. So that's something we would anticipate happening in a place like Arizona and much of the western US. So what happens in the summer? Well, you guys know what happens in the summer. We have the monsoon. Monsoon, we don't get storms coming in from the west. We get moisture coming in from Mexico. So the monsoon means a seasonal shift in the circulation. So the monsoon is a season, not a particular storm. And so all summer long, starting in late June or so, we start to get flow where we have air moving from the south. And so we have a lot of warm water off the coast of Mexico, because it's tropical water, and it gets up into the 80s, 85 degrees. It gets very, very warm, and we get a lot of evaporation, and there's a lot of moisture in the air. And it starts out way in southern Mexico in June, and by July it's moved up, so it's just south of Arizona, and all that moisture comes in, and we get thunderstorms, daily thunderstorms, kind of like what you guys had the other day, except what you had the other day was actually a low pressure system. It was more of a winter pattern. But what you had previous to that all summer was those thunderstorms that would pop up actually fairly common and often. Okay, so average precipitation for the whole state of Arizona. Well, the darker blue is the wetter areas, and you can see along the darkest area is kind of the Mogollon Rim. That's where we go from the really low desert off here to the southwest up to the high country and the Colorado Plateau way up in the far northeast corner. And so most of that precipitation, what happens is the air comes along and it hits the Mogollon, the mountains, and it's forced to go up. And when the air is forced to rise, it cools. And as it cools, eventually it gets cold enough that moisture, that's vapor, becomes condensed into clouds. We get clouds, we get rain. And that's what happens, is we get most of our rain on our higher elevations. So in February, the winter stuff, most of the northern part of the state gets their precipitation in the winter, and they get some in the summer too, but the southern part of the state, they don't get very much in the winter because, as I said, most of those storms don't come down that far. In the summer, this is a monsoon, typical monsoon, so you can see even northern Arizona gets a lot of precipitation in the summer, but almost all the precipitation in the southern part of the state comes in the summertime. So you'll hear something that's being talked about now called El Nino and La Nina. El Nino is a situation where or La Nina is a situation where we get colder than normal water off in the central Pacific, and we have high pressure that blocks those storms. Remember I said those storms come down the coast in the winter and cross in? Well, the high pressure prevents that from happening, and the storms go over and catch Montana, Idaho, Washington and Oregon, but they don't come down into Southern California or even Central California, and they certainly don't come into Arizona. And then they head off toward the East Coast, and all those people get a lot of snow. That's what we've been having in the past few years. El Nino is a different circulation where we have warm water in the Central Pacific, and that high pressure doesn't block anything. That low pressure is there, and that's those storm systems that will come down the coast, and they combine with this moist air here to provide us with a huge amount of precipitation in all the southern states, Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, Southern California, and all off into the Gulf Coast as well. So that's what we're anticipating this year. We're hoping that we're going to have a really wet winter, which will be really nice, and hopefully we'll get a lot of snow. Now, how do we measure snow? Well, we use rain gauges to measure snow. And It's really important we have automated weather rain gauges in places where there's no people, but we have a lot of holes in Arizona. We have a lot of places where there's not that many people, so we use those automated gauges. But even in places where we have a lot of people, the rain that happens in downtown Sedona versus the rain that happens in Cornville versus the rain that happens up at Camp Verde are completely different. So they could be just pounded with rain in Camp Verde and you guys get nothing, or you guys get pounded and they get nothing. That's really a common thing. So the more rain gauges we have, the better idea we have of where did it rain, how much did they get, and what's going on.